So the Our Flag Means Death Season 2 finale dropped, and the reviews are, let's charitably say, mixed. It's one of those CBD drinks. I'm gonna need it today because of the topic I'm covering. And also, I drink these a lot, so if they would like to sponsor me, I will also gladly accept an Arab sponsorship because I use my bottle all the time, or a Raycon sponsorship because I need a new pair of Raycons. A couple of years ago, I made a video about the terrible finale to a show that used to be one of my favourites, The 100. And a little while before that, I did a video where I talked about how the show had helped me on my journey of bi discovery because it made me feel seen to see a woman who was openly bi on screen. And not just that, but a main character. In the more recent of the two, I touched on a collective of fans based on a ship that I hate touching on because my experience with them has been almost entirely negative, and their overall presence on the internet is one based entirely on hate. Speaking of ship wars, I don't like to get into Clexa discourse because I don't fancy being murdered anytime soon, but it was in the finale, so unfortunately I have to talk about it. How is this relevant to Our Flag Means Death, you ask? We will get to it. Spoilers ahead for Our Flag Means Death, The 100, Good Omens, Sex Education, Wedding Plan, and Only Friends. Possibly another couple of things I'll sprinkle in there as I go. Before I get started, I need to make it clear that I'm not referring to every single Clexa in existence. I'm specifically referring to those people who claimed to quit the show after Clexa died, and then spent the next 4 years tweeting constantly about the show, harassing the actors, and just generally being terrible to other people on the internet. Unfortunately, as with everything, the worst people have the loudest voices, and these people have come to represent that entire section of the fandom in a way I believe is pretty harmful. Obviously, they are not the only ones, but they are the clearest example of the worst faith interpretation that fandom can take and run away with. So we're going to start from there. Let's break this down a bit. What is Clexa? Clexa is the ship of Clark Griffin, the main character of The 100, a bisexual badass constantly thrust into moral quandaries, and Lexa, the leader of the 12 Grounder clans, a lesbian, and a pseudo-antagonist. This isn't opinion, this is an actual factual description of her depiction on screen, but I can already hear the screeching from the comments below, so let me explain. Lexa was introduced as an antagonist. Not necessarily a villain, but definitely somebody who forced Clark into negative situations. She had to kill Finn because of her, and Finn's own actions, but Lexa's response to those actions is why Clark had to kill Finn.
You may have your truce. Thank you. I just need one thing in return. Tell me. Deliver me the one you call Finn. Our truce begins with his death.
Which then led to the conversation where Lexa implanted the idea of love is weakness, which informed the rest of Clark's emotional trauma throughout the show.
Weakness. What is love?
She also abandoned Clark at Mount Weather, so she had to make the most morally dubious decision in the show on her own at 18 years old. Obviously, Bellamy was there too, but you get my point. Then, in season 3, Lexa chased her down while she was on the run, only to rescue her, essentially so she could use her in a power play. Then, emotionally manipulated her into a relationship. Okay, that bit was a bit biased. It's unfair of me to say she manipulated her into the relationship. That's up to your interpretation. Anyway, then they date, and then very shortly after they sleep together, Lexa dies. Clexa was a great milestone in television, in that not only was the bisexual character a main character, seriously, I cannot stress enough how big of a deal this was to me and hundreds, of other burgeoning bis, but she didn't suddenly become a lesbian after her first kiss with a woman. To be clear, I'm not saying that lesbians don't need or deserve representation too, they absolutely do, but in every other example of a woman who had previously only been attracted to men suddenly falling for a woman that I had seen, it was almost always a lesbian story, or even worse, the queer attraction was a brief phase and then she went back to being straight. The very few times I had seen someone explicitly bisexual, although usually not verbally, because for some reason scriptwriters are terrified of using the word, it was usually some kind of promiscuous caricature. So Clark was a breath of fresh air. She was bisexual, but she wasn't an over-sexualized, underhumanized object. She didn't become exclusively attracted to women after we saw her kiss one, and she didn't claim to return to heterosexuality once Lexa was gone. Plus, she wasn't the only queer character. Other than Lexa, we also had Nate, Brian, Nyla, and Jackson as confirmed in canon, and then a bunch of other characters you could easily headcanon as being on the spectrum of queer identities. Overall, the 100 had actually pretty great queer representation for the CW at that time. But if you try to tell those Clexas that, they'll claw your eyes out. Because Lexa's death was bury or gaze, and how dare you suggest that their trauma at Lexa's death is invalid, and Clexa was clearly endgame. It wasn't, I didn't, and it clearly wasn't. Clexa was never written to be endgame, and any first-year writing student could tell you that. Hell, most first-year writing students could have told you Lexa was bound to die from the moment she stepped on screen long before we knew she was gay. Sort of Damocles and all that. I would also never suggest a person's trauma at something is invalid, but I'm going to speak on that more later, so let's talk about burying the gays. This trope was so named because it had become something of a pattern in shows to kill off a gay side character for shock value, often a lesbian, which then integrates the additional rage caused by the fridging of women in fiction, which is an even older trope of narratives, killing off a female love interest for shock value to spur the male character on. The large backlash around bury your gays, in particular around the 2014 to 2016 period, was specifically the tendency to kill off gay characters in a story full of mostly straight characters, or when the death appears to happen because they are gay. The most obvious example of this, the OG, if you will, is Tara's death in Buffy. It happens as a consequence of somebody else's actions. The guy wasn't actually trying to kill Tara, who was aiming for Buffy, and it's clearly written only because they needed a character death for shock value. A stray bullet catches Tara right after she and Willow reaffirmed their love for each other in their heartfelt confessions, and it was devastating. And unfortunately, Lexa's death follows the exact same plot as Tara's, almost beat for beat. She catches a stray bullet meant for Clark right after they sleep together and affirm their relationship, which is precisely why in 2016, when the resurgence of backlash around the trope happened due to an unfortunate number of shows seeming to do it at once, the death of Lexa was upheld as the example of bury or gaze. The problem with this is that it simply isn't an example of bury or gaze. It accidentally copied Tara's death to a T, which is definitely bad, but Lexa wasn't killed because of her sexuality, nor was she a character seen as expendable specifically because she was a queer character in a story full of straight ones. She was killed off because she was a pseudo-antagonist who had been written to be that way. On top of this, the show never forgets about her, even seasons after her death, sometimes to the show's detriment. Bury or gaze implies a carelessness, a callous disregard for queer lives in order to use us as props, but Lexa was not that. She was very relevant to the plot, both while she was on the show and after she was gone. And I get that it was painful for lesbians to see a character they liked and or identified with killed off, but as I will elaborate on later, just because something is upsetting or you personally don't like it, doesn't mean it's automatically bad. If there were any character deaths or treatment of minorities people should have been angry at during the 100's run, it was their treatment of black people, by the way. Wells's death, the benching of Lincoln's character in season 3, which led to his incredibly traumatic death, and all of the stuff that Ricky Whittle has said about that. The way Miller was consistently sidelined despite being one of the original delinquents and other main queer characters on the show. Like, I'm not saying there aren't reasons to be mad at the writers for underrepresenting or killing off minorities. I'm just saying you're angry about the wrong minority. When I warned my mother there was a death in season 3 that got a lot of backlash, so she was prepared, she came back after she watched the season like, yeah, I understood completely why there was backlash. Lincoln's death felt really unnecessary and bizarrely racially motivated. And then I had to explain to her that that wasn't the death that got the backlash. The problem with bury or gaze as a catch-all is that it's a collectivist label. In order for something to be labeled with it, it has to follow a trend when taken out of context. As opposed to like fridging women, for example, which is very clear every time it happens without needing to group it in or compare it with other examples. Lexa's death could be seen as an example of fridging a woman more so than bury or gaze, but even then it doesn't quite fit because the person's arc she's advancing is also a woman's. Bury or gaze is an ineffective tool to judge how good or accurate or moral a piece of media is in the same way that the Bechdel test is. It's not designed to prove one piece of media is better than another using only that as a metric, and anybody who thinks it is needs to go outside and touch grass. I am not joking. The Bechdel test exists because the idea of it is that it's the bare minimum a movie could aspire to in terms of feminism, and a lot of movies don't clear it. Does that mean that every movie that doesn't clear it is bad? No! Sometimes stories just literally aren't about women. Pixar's Up doesn't pass the Bechdel test. Neither does Breakfast at Tiffany's, Arrival, or Pacific Rim. If anybody tries to tell me any of those movies were bad, I will simply end the conversation there because that person is not worth talking to. You're gonna look me in the eyes and tell me Pacific Rim isn't worth my time?
But I'm not gonna dial down my moves.
Then neither will I.
Plus, some films pass the Bechdel test that arguably represent women in a worse light than those films, like Weird Science, American Pie 2, and Showgirls. Now don't get me wrong, I love Showgirls. but I wouldn't call it a feminist masterpiece. It's the same problem I have with people complaining about female representation in BLs. The shows about gay romance do not always need to have women in them, and if there are women in them, they don't always need to be bastions of humanity. Yes, it sucks that in early Thai BL, there were so many villainous female characters, and sometimes that clearly stems from misogyny, but also, that's not always where it comes from. And it's not always a bad thing either. Sometimes women are evil, and that's feminism. The point is, it's not supposed to be used to prop up the morality of a film's representation, it's just supposed to track a trend in order to bring attention to it. And the moment we started using it to shame showrunners for every gay character's death, regardless of whether it fit into the criteria, was the moment media criticism died. The thing that we need to re-remember as a society is that you can not like something without having to prescribe some kind of moral failing to it in order to justify not liking it. This goes for shows, characters, celebrities, human people that you know. Like, it doesn't make you a bad person just to not like somebody's vibe. You don't have to get on with everybody and not everybody has to like you. You're allowed to just not really like someone. You don't necessarily need a reason, and if you have a reason, great. If your only reason is that their vibes are off, also great. As long as you're not going around bitching about that person or causing problems for them in their personal life, it's not actually an issue to just not get on with people. Same goes for TV shows, characters, games. You're allowed to just not like a decision a writer has made without having to find some kind of moral reason why it's bad, without having to lord superiority over them to prove that you know more about that character or about morality and what is just and correct than what the writers do, because you didn't like the decision they made. There isn't a right decision. Sorry. And this is something that's taken me a very, very long time in fandom to figure out. So for those of you who are younger than me, you're probably gnashing your teeth at the screen right now trying to tell me I'm wrong. But I promise you, I'm not. Sometimes you're not going to like a decision a writer has made. Very rarely is it going to be because that decision was actually incorrect. And it does happen. The finale of Game of Thrones happened, seasons 5 and 7 of The 100 happened, the Veronica Mars reboot happened. There are times when the writers get in their heads, let the hubris get to them, decide that they are gods ruling over the characters and that whatever decision they make is correct, even if it is wildly out of character or frustratingly cliche or Deus Ex Machina levels of stupid plot development. But it is not what's happening every single time a character does something or there is a plot development that you don't like. Just because you don't like it doesn't mean that that was the wrong decision for the writer to have made. And that's true even if the majority of the fandom doesn't like it. I hated Becco as a pairing in The 100 because they were bad. People would argue, you just hated them because you were a Bellark stan, but I liked Clexa until the fandom ruined it, and I like Bellamy's girlfriend Gina too. Echo just sucked as a character. I don't need to find a moral reason for that, by the way. I could if I wanted to, but I won't. It's too much energy to waste on her. She just sucks. I hated her. I hated the way she was written, hated the way she was acted. Sorry, Tassia. And the thing is, I absolutely understand why the writers put them together, because what they needed was an extra obstacle to Bellamy and Clark getting together on top of the 5 years, and the only other options on the arc were Harper, Amori, and Raven. Harper's out because she's with Monty, Amori is out because she's with Murphy, and they couldn't pair him with Raven because too many people already shipped him and Raven, so by putting them together and then breaking them up, you would have an even angrier fandom on your hands, and especially post-Clexa, they were not willing to risk that. So the only option for a romantic partner that would serve as an obstacle between Bellamy and Clark was Echo. It was the only choice they had, and I agree with it, and I respect it. What I didn't agree with was them trying to justify that constantly within the show. And with parts of the fandom that suddenly decided they were ride or die for them, and that they were a better pairing than Bellark, and it's like, alright. Slow your fucking roll. But the writers clearly acted this way about Becco because of the backlash around Clexa's ending. They were terrified of the fandom turning on them again, and so they kept trying to justify why Becco were actually a great relationship when anybody with eyes or any vested interest in the plot of the show before season 5 could tell you they weren't. I can dislike the decision to keep them together post season 5 without having to morally justify why it's a bad one. Because it's not necessarily a bad one. I do think the better way of writing it would have been to get Bellamy and Amori together after her and Murphy break up on the arc, because then you've got a very easy way to have an obstacle and establish a romantic connection that also allows them to make a cleaner break when they realize Clark is alive, where Amori can go back to Murphy and Bellamy can go back to Clark, and also adds interesting personal dynamic shifts into the gang's relationship post-Primefire. It would have been, in my opinion, much better and the more interesting option, but I understand why they went with Echo. I just think they underestimated the shipping culture at play, because if you put two people together, even just for an episode, somebody is going to decide that they are the best couple in the world and scream like a toddler if you take it away from them. I'm not even saying that in a negative way. I've done it. There is always somebody who is willing to ride or die for the dumbest pairings you've ever heard of, and sometimes that somebody is you. But the writers' room clearly didn't take this into account, and then felt the need to double down on Becco in the subsequent seasons, both to appease fans, particularly after the Clexa debacle, and so Jason could pretend that the remaining audience wasn't watching it mainly for Bellark, because he wanted his edgy sci-fi show to not have to rely on shippers to keep it going, which I understand as a writer who wants to be respected for my craft, and I sympathize, but also if you don't want people watching the show for the main pairing, don't accidentally write one of the greatest love stories ever, dipshit. The 100 is a unique example because it's one of the few shows that actually did make objectively incorrect decisions. Feel free to watch my review of the finale for clarity on that, but it made plenty of choices along the way that fans vehemently despised that were, in essence, entirely correct. The Hackledama fight, when it aired, was devastating to fans, but as the years went by, it became one of the best storylines in a season muddied by quite a few less regarded ones that were better regarded at the time it was airing.
You were not in charge here. And that's a good thing because people die when you're in charge. You made a deal with Clexa, who left us in Mount Weather to die and forced us to kill everyone who helped us.
Entirely because the angst involved relied on the two main characters acting in character on opposite sides of an issue, and it gave the audience the perspective to understand where both were coming from. The problem with the audience response to things like this is that a lot of times it seems to come from an innate misunderstanding of the thing you're watching, not because you're doing anything wrong, but because the idea of the show in your head is not the show itself. As Tumblr user Bumblebee Bats put it, I feel like some people need to relearn genre expectations. Man, this tragedy sucks. Why didn't they just do XYZ? Then everything could have ended happily. Well, then it wouldn't be a tragedy, would it? Man, this lighthearted teen rom-com is terrible. It's so sappy and unrealistic. Well, yeah. If it had been gritty and dark, it wouldn't have been a lighthearted rom-com, would it? Is the writing actually bad, or are you just trying to order a milkshake from Home Depot? This is something which I brought up in my Heartstopper Only Friends video, so feel free to check that out if you want me to elaborate more on that. But it is becoming an increasingly common thing to see fans complaining about the very nature of the show they are choosing to watch and engage with on a weekly basis. And sometimes it's like, girl, maybe this is just not the show for you. OMG, I can't believe Will is in love with Hannibal, even though he knows he's a cannibal serial killer. This is so toxic. Yeah. That's quite literally the point. And I know that, like, for those of us who are super neurospicy, or even those of us who are mildly neurospicy, or even if you're not spicy at all, you're lemon and herb, you can't control the shows that you love. Maybe you don't want to find something else to watch that will have a happy ending, because that's not the thing that spoke to you about this. But, as the post said, you can't try to buy a milkshake in a hardware store and then complain that they don't have ice cream. I think we forget, as an audience, that this is a parasitic relationship. I don't mean that with negative connotations, I mean that in, like, the wildlife documentary way. The show, the book, the movie, the video game, whatever it is, the piece of media that we are consuming is the host. And we, as the audience, are the parasites. We can only live if we feed off of the host, but if we take too much away from the host, it will die. So in order for us to stay alive, we need the host to keep functioning as normal. Now, there are parasitic species out there that do kill off the thing they are attached to, as there are fandoms that will ruin the show they are glomming onto. But, for the most part, it should be a kind of healthy symbiotic relationship. This should not be a situation where we're constantly attacking the host because it ate something we didn't like. The host isn't eating for us, it's eating for itself. We're just stealing. This metaphor's getting away from me a bit, but you know what I mean. Demanding quote-unquote good representation from a show is all well and good, but even when we're given it, we'll find a way to tear it to shreds. Because we're a parasite. We always want more and bigger and better, and we don't care if that's not what the host wants. We're the ones hitching a ride, goddammit! You owe us! Good representation is a death knell for good storytelling. It's a handicap. And I say this as somebody who wants it. Showrunners are kind of damned if they do, damned if they don't. If they don't give us representation at all, it's homophobic. If they do give it to us, there are 1,000 reasons why it's problematic. This has a similar ring to it as when Crowley kissed Aziraphale at the end of season 2 of Good Omens, and some Ace and Arrow Ace people were upset because that meant that it wasn't an Ace story anymore. As I said in my video on it, first of all, just because they're kissing doesn't make it not an Ace storyline, so jot that down. Second of all, if they hadn't addressed the romantic subtext, Joel would have accused Neil of queerbaiting again, which is what he was getting throughout the entire first season, because people hated that he wouldn't just confirm that they wanted to tear each other's clothes off, and he specifically said he wouldn't confirm that because he knew some of the fandom headcanoned them as Ace or something else, and he wanted to leave it more ambiguous to include more interpretations. And then he made it explicit, and y'all complained anyway. Which in turn holds the same energy as complaining when Nandor or Guillermo screw each other over in What We Do in the Shadows.
What did you just say?
The only reason you're alive is because I let you live.
Once a familiar, always a familiar!
Anybody who wants their romance to be cute and wholesome and entirely free from reproach is watching the wrong show. You are watching the immoral, self-centered vampire show and you're expecting characters to behave differently? That sounds like a you problem. I too want Nandemo to smooch, but that doesn't mean I hate the show every time one of them does something to hurt the other. That's literally the nature of their relationship. I don't know what to tell you. Which finally brings me to the reason I started writing this in the first place. Our flag means death. The final third of the modern super hulock.
The magic spell you cast, this is the Rose.
Yeah, Of course I've just got a pirate hat lying around. I'm bisexual. The finale of the second season of Our Flag Means Death dropped this week, and among a number of other things like Steed and Ed officially getting together, Pete and Lucius getting married, and Jim and Archie affirming they're inseparable, Izzy Hands was devastatingly killed off, and people are so fucking upset. His death was dramatic and beautiful, and it came after a whole season of him learning and growing from his past into a more authentic, happier version of himself, and for some people, this was incredibly triggering. Because queer people aren't allowed to be happy, and the moment one finds his chosen family and true happiness, he's killed off, and how dare the showrunners lull us into a false sense of security and make us feel like they cared about us as a community, only to pull the rug out from under us like that. For some people, this was their final straw with the show, a complete betrayal, a devastating blow to their psyche. And as a neurodivergent queer person who's had the rug yanked out from under her by showrunners before, I empathize with this reaction, and nobody can tell you you're wrong for feeling a certain way about something. However, some of y'all need to chill the fuck out. I've seen posts comparing this episode to the final season of Game of Thrones. I've seen people refer to Ed as Izzy's abuser and how it was disgusting for him to die in his abuser's arms. I'll touch more on that in a minute, put a pin in it. I've seen posts picking apart all the ways his death made no sense and they could have written something else, how cruel and homophobic and ableist this was to make a disabled queer character disposable, and that it's an unforgivable mistake for the writers to have killed him off. One such post, just as a random example, said this: "Well, that's it for me then. I mainly watched OMFD for Ed Izzy, and they killed my fave and sank my ship to the bottom of the sea. I don't know why I bother with fandom anymore, TBH. Every character I fall in love with gets maligned and killed to promote the writer's OTP." Bearing in mind that in this case, the writer's OTP are literally the main characters of the show you are watching. The OP responds with, "Yeah, I'll probably watch the next season for the hell of it on some illicit site, but my interest and engagement has plummeted. I didn't even cry or feel sad when Izzy died. I was just annoyed at how bad the execution was." That's it? No meaningful moment? Just a bullet? That's seriously what is killing him? Why is the entire crew so far away? If it makes you feel any better though, it didn't even promote the writer's OTP. Izzy's death advanced nothing, including their horribly handled subplot. Steed and Eddie didn't even discuss Steed wanting to be a pirate and Ed wanting to retire. Steed's given up the dream to try to run an inn, something he has never done before, with a man who also has no inn-running experience. And that found family gone off on their own. First of all, to say his death had no meaningful moment, did we watch the same scene? Because I was sobbing, as was Ed, who has been Izzy's closest person since day one, regardless of what context you see their relationship in. Also, he wasn't killed off to promote Black Bonnet, and suggesting he was is baffling. That's not the writers reducing Izzy to a plot point to advance the characters, that's you reducing him to that, so you can be angrier about his death. The writers gave him the respect he was due in his death precisely by making it not about Black Bonnet. It was about Izzy and Ed. Steed and Ed's relationship is separate to Izzy because it's separate to Izzy. Just because he's your favorite character does not mean the writers owe him more than they owe the main characters of the TV show they're writing. And I get it, he was beloved, and they definitely underestimated just how beloved he was. But guys, seriously, to those people, may I suggest going outside, talking to other human beings, absorbing what's happening to Palestinians, and maybe realizing how much simple joy we take for granted. Now, I'm not saying they're being genocided so you're not allowed to complain about things, but what I am saying is that sometimes you do actually need to take a step back and get some perspective on your feelings, because it's all too easy, especially in the age of the internet, to get bogged down in the finer details and forget to zoom out. I really want to make it clear, again, that I'm not in any way devaluing the intense guttural emotional reaction that anybody has had to Izzy's death. I think it's important to recognize that those feelings are important to feel, even if I disagree with how you've expressed them or how that comes out after the fact. Like, those feelings of devastation are completely valid. Like, last year before, when Vincenzo came out, which was a K-drama, there's a character in Vincenzo that almost from the beginning, if you know anything about writing, is kind of set up to be the character that, like, you're going to kind of fall in love with a little bit only for him to be killed off. But you like him so much that there's this moment when he does get shot, where he does die. Like, I didn't watch the finale because I found out ahead of time, dangers of being on Tumblr, and I didn't watch the finale for like 3 weeks afterwards because I knew he died and I didn't want to deal with it. And I was upset and I was frustrated, and people were pissed off because they created this character who was like beloved and then killed him off. And in hindsight, it's like, well, yeah, he was obviously written to be killed off. That's the kind of character that he was. He wasn't there to get his happily ever after, which is unfortunate. But like, I was devastated. It was awful. And I was angry about it for a while. But that didn't make the show bad. It didn't mean the show had done something wrong. It just meant the show had done something I disagreed with. This is one of those things that, like, I think people need space from in order to think rationally about. Which is how any big guttural emotional reaction works, realistically speaking. And none of this is to say in any way that having a negative reaction is a bad thing. You're well within your rights to drop the show like a hot potato and never pick it up again if that's what's best for you. And in fact, if that is what's better for you mental health-wise, I fully endorse it. Problem comes when you allow those negative feelings to calcify into something reactive. One such fan refers to the same post I did earlier about milkshakes in Home Depot in order to rationalize their feelings about the finale, fundamentally misunderstanding the point of that post. It struck me as a great framing of what went wrong with the OFMD finale. We walked into that Home Depot and got a milkshake thrown at our face. The point isn't so much the quality of the milkshake as that we were in a fucking Home Depot. And yeah, many of us saw the big clown standing there with a milkshake in its hand, but we kind of assumed it was an inflatable Halloween decoration because it was in a Home Depot. We reasonably expected some light milkshake-related prankery, but nobody goes into a Home Depot expecting to take an entire milkshake straight to the face. Now, we gotta go home and change before we can finish our errands. It's not the end of the world, but you can see why we're not sure we want to shop at Home Depot anymore. Even if the CEO of Home Depot vague tweets something that might mean that he now understands that the milkshake clown event was not something customers wanted. First of all, like you said, you saw the clown in the corner holding a milkshake, so that probably should have clued you into the fact that this isn't a normal Home Depot when you entered. I get it, you put your guard down and are shocked by the results, but that doesn't mean the show wasn't telling you exactly what it was the entire time. Our Flag Means Death has never been a stranger to pulling gut-wrenching twists on us. If you want proof of that, look no further than the finale of Season 1, which sent the entire fandom into a tailspin for a year, stressing about both the main characters, or the death of Carl, or the numerous low blows delivered to characters both in the first season and this one. It's not actually a fluffy, cute show all the time, despite the way it dresses itself up with comedy. It's a show about pirates and violence and people making bad decisions, and occasionally men kissing. A character death has never been off the table. And in this season, it's actually been pretty heavily telegraphed the entire time. Do I think the writers should have looked at past similar decisions by showrunners that have resulted in similar backlash a la Killing Eve and The 100? Yes. Do I think their decision to kill off Izzy was wrong? No. Sorry. I really don't. I absolutely understand why people do, though, don't get me wrong. I get why, as a queer person, an older queer person, a disabled person, you might have identified with Izzy as a character, and why seeing him killed off feels like a personal attack. I've been there. It's horribly painful, and I empathize. But that doesn't mean it was the wrong thing to do. David Jenkins and the writers were looking through the lens of the vacuum of a writer's room, just through the perspective of the story being told, and not taking into account the wider cultural context surrounding queer media, and in particular, deaths in queer media. That was a slight stumble on their part. However, I would always rather a writer wrote the story they wanted to tell than bowed to the whim of the loudest fans, because the loudest fans aren't always correct. They're just the loudest. Cough, Clexa, cough. You might be saying that the reason Game of Thrones shat the bed so royally is because they didn't listen to the fandom, but nope! That's not actually true. Some of the loudest fandom theories and desires were stupid. I don't need to call them out, we've all seen them. Listening to those fans wouldn't have made the show any better either. The Game of Thrones ending was bad because the writers didn't care anymore. That's literally it. It is as simple as that. The writers had moved on to other things, but they had to wrap up the thing they were supposed to be working on first. So they scrambled to put together a finale, and then ignored every warning sign leading up to releasing it, like the clear negative reaction at the table reads, the offers to give them more episodes in time, and the numerous press junkets where the cast was clearly trying not to say anything too positive. I can see why people think Izzy's death feels unfair, especially after we watched him grow as a person this whole season, but I think reducing it to some half-baked comparison to other shows that killed characters off in much worse faith settings for much stupider reasons is offensive to the writers, to the show, and to Izzy himself. As Tumblr user Our Flag Means Gay Rights says, actually, can we stop talking about deserve when it comes to characters dying in fiction? Not everything is a fable with a moral lesson to be learned. Romeo and Juliet didn't deserve to die. Bambi's mum didn't deserve to die. Izzy dying in the finale doesn't mean Our Flag Means Death is saying that certain types of queer people deserve to die. Fictional death can serve more narrative purposes than just punishment for the character doing the dying. Another Tumblrite, Totally Boatless, added to this with, yeah, exactly. And for the examples you listed, the undeserved death is used to show the audience something is f***ed up in the world. Romeo and Juliet in particular, which I have a pinned Our Flag Means Death essay about, lol, uses the protag's death not as a judgment on their actions, but to force a reckoning for the other characters with how terrible their society has become that they're driving their kids to suicide. Izzy's death serves as a uniting front for all of our pirates. The fact that he was just starting to grow and learn to love himself and that opportunity was torn away from him is tragic. And it wasn't Izzy's fault. It was imperialist society on a rampage. And now, most of our pirates are sailing after his killers on a ship called the Revenge. That's not writing that tells us that Izzy deserved it in the least. Part of why Izzy's death is so impactful, and part of why a certain group of people are rejecting it so hard, is precisely because it's almost too realistic. We've seen queer people get struck down in their prime through no fault of their own. Some of us are old enough to have personally witnessed people torn from found families and broken down and killed. Some of us are young enough to have grown up hearing all those stories. Izzy's death hurts because it's senseless and he didn't deserve it, and that's the point. So I had to rewatch Izzy's death scene to record the footage for it to put in the video. And having rewatched it, I have my own thoughts about this. And this is very much my meta and my opinion. So this may not be what they're going for at all. But does no one else watch that scene and just get this feeling of like a queer passing of the torch? The older generation of queers handing it off to the younger generation, because the older generation of queers lived in so much more of a dangerous environment. Like, so much of Our Flag Means Death is allegorical, right? Like, it's piracy. Piracy was innately queer. It was innately outside of the law. It was innately, full of minorities. But, like, so much of the show has been drawing parallels between that and modern society and modern queer life and the life that people who are Con's age and gay and the life they live through, watching people just die by the hundreds, by the thousands in the 80s of AIDS. And like, it was senseless. Gay men and women and non-binary people and trans people did senselessly die of neglect, of abuse, of AIDS. This episode in particular, the speech Izzy gives beforehand about finding family is so clearly trying to reach through the screen, to hold your hand as a queer person in 2023 and say, look at what the generations of queer people went through before you. I would like to leave the world better than I found it.
It's about belonging to something when the world has told you you're nothing. It's about finding the family to kill for when yours are long dead. It's about letting go of ego for something larger. The crew.
People complaining that his final moments were about Ed. I mean, yeah, but no.
Just be it.
It's so clearly not about Ed, it's about us. Be you. Be unapologetically you. Be queer. Exist, because people before us died so we could do that. Sacrifice themselves on the altar of being queer so that we could live this life. It's devastating, but it's so clearly intentional. To me, at least, it feels so clearly purposeful. It was written not as a way to prop up the main couple, which, by the way, even if it had been perfectly well within its rights to do, because that's what the show is about, but it's about identity. And that's why it's so upsetting, but it's also why it's not the wrong choice. It's sending that message to young queer people, allegorically, or at least this is, my opinion. This is how I have interpreted it. Art doesn't always have to make you feel good. Now, I know that we all know this rationally, but I think there's something primal in us that is desperate to reject something if it makes us feel a negative emotion we weren't expecting to feel. If you go into Marley and Me expecting to cry, you'll have, maybe not a good time, but the time you're expecting to have. If you go into Marley and Me not knowing what happens to the dog and you're blindsided by what you thought was a feel-good movie, you're going to have an extremely negative reaction. I vividly remember walking out of Bridge to Terabithia as like an 8-year-old furious at what happened. If, as an adult, I watched that movie with a little context as to the tone, I think I would cry and absorb the message of the film, but as a child, when I thought I was watching a fun children's movie, and then it bait and switched me with a child death halfway through, it made me devastated and incandescent with frustration, because why would they do that? Tumblr user Spitblaze, when discussing postmodern art criticism, addressed something similar. It's just as important to note that in many cases there's no wrong answers in art or interpretation. If your takeaway is completely different from the artist, as long as you don't try to insist that the artist has no real say over their work's meaning, that's totally fine. A large part of non-representational art is reliant on emotions, and emotions are informed by your experience as a human being. Your interpretation is just as right as anyone else's, and you don't even have to like everything. I hate Jeff Koons and his stupid balloon dogs. Cremaster makes me incredibly uncomfortable, and even if that's the point, it's still uncomfortable enough that it makes me not like it. You can just not like certain art. It's not all or nothing, it's good or it's not. TLDR, if you have a hard time getting art, try listening to your base reaction to what you're looking at, and then ask yourself why it makes you feel that way and why it's constructed the way it is. Does it suck that Izzy died? Yes. Does it make the show retroactively bad or not good representation because of it? No. Don't be stupid. You're absolutely entitled to be hurt by what happened and how it happened. I understand better than anyone exactly what it feels like when a show betrays you, whether it's just because something you personally didn't want to happen happens, or because it is actually written badly. It hurts. We're not capable of distinguishing the difference between our connection to fictional characters and real people. It hurts the same. When Doctor Who started going downhill, it affected my mental health. When season 5 of The 100 screwed over a bunch of characters, I swore I'd never watch the show again, and when the finale dropped, I had a panic attack in my flat. When Veronica Mars killed off Logan, I almost threw my laptop. When you're that attached to something and it hurts you, it feels insurmountable. But, as She Plays With Fire pointed out, it's not burying your gaze every time a queer-coded character dies. Lucius and Pete married each other. Edward and Steed are going to build a home together, and they kiss like 5 times. Archie and Jim kissed again and stayed together and have made it clear they're a package deal. Izzy didn't die because of his queer coding or because he confessed his having love for Ed. He died because his storyline came to the end the writers felt was most true to the character they'd written, and because his death would have the most impact for Ed as primary love interest. Disagreeing with the necessity of that death is one thing. Trying to claim it's homophobia or queerbait or burying your gaze is another. And here's where I want to touch on the people referring to Ed as Izzy's abuser. I love a good meta post as much as the rest of you freaks, and I've even written a number of them in my time. Art exists to be read into and interpreted. It exists to be discussed, to be picked apart and admired and disdained, because that is the nature of humanity. I'm no stranger to diagnosing a character with a mental illness or comparing various interpretations of characters of dynamics. It's part of the fun of engaging with fandom. Unfortunately, though, the therapization of characters is only good up to a point. Then it starts to ruin your experience within fandom. I'm deadly serious. You have to be careful not to overstep from writing meta to writing headcanons and then mixing up the two, which is very easy to do. We've all fallen victim to forgetting that the version of the character you carry with you isn't necessarily the one in the script or in the actor's head while they're performing. I also don't think you'll understand the gravity of some of the terminology you're using. Referring to a character as another character's abuser better come with something to back that shit up, or somebody who actually had to live through abuse is gonna see that as minimizing their lived experience. Calling Ed Izzy's abuser is hyperbolic, ridiculous, and takes away the agency of this incredibly smart, dangerous, self-reliant character that you're claiming to love so much. The Venn diagram of therapization of characters and the fanonization of characters can become a circle if you're not too careful. There are 2 camps of people who think that labeling a negative action within a relationship portrayed on screen as abusive when it isn't necessarily is the correct response. One side is people who simply need to justify their dislike of something, and labeling it as abusive is the quickest and easiest way to justify their hatred of it. And they might not even be doing it consciously, but it is becoming an increasingly common refrain in fandom spaces. The other camp of people are abuse victims themselves and feel triggered seeing behaviors that they know to be abusive emulated on screen in a relationship that they looked to as safe, basically. I get where this one is coming from because as a victim of abuse myself, I have been there. However, I'm going to use The 100 as an example again because this is the fandom that I've seen the most ups and downs within, and some of the worst fandom behavior in terms of connecting with the source material and getting angry about the wrong thing, because I was there. I was in the trenches.
I was there, man. You saw it happen, man. You saw the whole thing, man.
All the other fandoms I was in before that, I was too young to really engage with on that level, except for Super Hulock, but we don't talk about that. And since then, I have come out of the 100 trenches, so for me, it's a good benchmark for what not to do as a fandom. For example, in season 5, there is a scene where Clark slaps Bellamy in the face. Now, out of context, that's very bad. Characters who are supposed to be in love with each other, or platonically, however you interpret their relationship, characters who care about each other, shouldn't be smacking each other. That is, from a lot of people's metrics, abusive. And this scene was a deal breaker for a lot of people in regards to their relationship. And I can see where they're coming from, for the most part. However, adding context to this scene, Bellamy has just endangered Clark's child's life after she explicitly asked him to protect her. Do you have any idea how many mothers would do so much worse than slap a man if they endangered their child? I'm not even a mother, and I'd cut a bitch. I think this is where the lack of nuance and throwing around of big therapy words with strong connotations can really harm how you engage with a piece of media as a fan or within the culture of a fandom. You start labeling things like that as abusive, people did. People referred to Clark as being abusive when she slapped Bellamy. Abuse generally requires a power imbalance in the relationship dynamic, where one side has all the control and there's a pattern of it, but the show goes out of its way over and over again to have Bellamy and Clark swap control at various points or land on equal footing, because that's the dynamic they have. They make hard decisions and sometimes they make the wrong ones. Bellamy did something to Clark's daughter that she had no control over without telling her. He did a super up thing. He's being neglectful of a child, which I think is worse than slapping somebody, and is also super out of character for him, but I digress. Season 5 was a dumpster fire in so many ways. We don't have time to get into the numerous out of character things that literally every character does, including having Clark electric shock that daughter a few episodes later. I think this is where all the wires get crossed so much within fandoms, because people have therapized these characters so much that anything less than a perfectly healthy relationship is worthy of divorce and should be judged accordingly. If one character slaps another, it's no longer an interesting story beat or an obstacle for the characters to overcome. It's abuse, and they should never get together. I have personally witnessed violence in the home. I've been on the receiving end of it. So seeing characters hit other characters they love isn't my favorite thing in the world, but I've also seen it enough to know when it is actually being portrayed as abusive, and when it is justified by the context of the characters and scene in which it is being written. And I think the big problem with labeling things with these words is that you strip back a lot of the nuance and the frame of reference that the writer's room is coming from. You're bringing your personal experiences to it, and you're telling it that it's portrayed something you don't like, and how dare it do that. But the writer's room isn't taking into account every single person's individual experience with those behaviors. They're just trying to write an interaction between characters that makes sense for them and the plot and hopefully entertains the audience. Fingers crossed. That's all they should care about. If they stopped to take stock of the possible negative reactions that every single person who could absorb the show would ever have to every single possible kind of scene, they would never get the show written. I'm sorry, they would never finish anything, because there is nothing you could possibly write ever that is harmless enough and safe enough that it isn't going to upset or offend somebody, and also it would be boring as fuck. And even if it wasn't, you'd find a way to make it problematic somehow. Speaking of, MAME is a Thai writer and director who is infamous among fandom circles for creating some of the most arguably toxic, high-heat romances in Thailand. Than Type, Love in the Air, Don't Say No, Love by Chance, particularly the second season which she directed, all incredibly popular BLs written and or directed by her and based on her creations. She made her name writing yaoi novels with a lot of, let's just call them dubious dynamics. The main thing that comes up when her name is mentioned is the backlash against the more toxic elements of her romantic pairings, particularly when it comes to consent or lack thereof. People have been saying for years that they would like to watch a MAME show without any of the problematic things she's known for. And then this year, we got exactly that, and people didn't watch it. Wedding Plan is a 2023 MAME show based around a wedding planner who falls in love with the groom of the wedding he's planning. Meanwhile, the bride and groom are actually participating in a lavender marriage, which the bride asked for to hide the fact that she has a girlfriend. People should have eaten this shit up, but instead, they were busy tying themselves in knots trying to make the show more problematic than it was so they could hate it.
No, just pick on somebody else.
What? I'm not picking on anybody. I asked if they were comfortable. Yeah, okay, so...
No, that's fine.
Okay, no, I know. I know that's fine. I stand behind my comments before that person decided to be an ally for a situation they perceived as uncomfortable, which wasn't. You are just saying, and you don't have to keep just saying.
People hated Cylon for not telling the truth about his fake wedding to Namnur even after they kissed, despite it not being his secret to tell, and the possible incredibly negative ramifications of his family finding out, and lambasted him for it as if he was some evil manipulator instead of a closeted queer man living an experience that many men across history have had to deal with. Men are dealing with it right now. Maybe let's not villainize him for that. They infantilized Namnur as if he wasn't in control of his own life and was being dragged around entirely at the whims of Lom. He wasn't. And they complained about the lesbian representation because the kiss wasn't great, despite it featuring the most plot-relevant and fleshed-out lesbians we've had in any BL thus far.
หวาเป็นคนขอพี่ลมแต่งงานเองค่ะคุณเหนือ คุณเหนือก็เห็นแม่หวาแล้วว่าเป็นคนยังไงอะแล้วหวาก็คิดแผนนี้ขึ้น หวาจะมีอิสระ พี่ลมก็จะมีอิสระ หวาก็เลยขอร้องพี่ลมค่ะ
พี่ลมกับพี่หวาปิดเรื่องนี้มาตั้ง13 ปีเลยนะคะเขาไม่เคยบอกใครเลยค่ะแม้กระทั่งเพื่อนสนิทว่าเมื่อเขาบอกเราแปลว่าหัวใจเขาแน่ใจแล้วค่ะว่าเป็นเรา
All the drama in this show comes from external factors, family issues, homophobia, the closet, and like maybe a bit of miscommunication, and not from lack of consent or dubious power dynamics. And yet, people tried to make every decision the characters made fit that mold. Fellow Tumblr user Benjio has a fantastic podcast episode on it. I've linked it below, but out of his own mouth.
Felt like a lot of the people who are reacting to this show have not been in the closet. I was in the closet for 11 years. Your brain does not work the same way on the inside. And I'm going to say, frankly, to anybody who thought Lom should have told Nem Nua a lot sooner than he did, when you've been in the closet for 13 years, you do not tell someone you have a crush on in 2 months of knowing them. The reason they're in the closet is because there will be severe and painful consequences for failing to maintain a heteronormative status quo. The big thing that separates Lom from Nem Nua is Nem Nua is out. The truth about who Nem Nua is cannot harm him. Nem Nua develops feelings for Lom and tells his boss. And she says, there's nothing wrong with you having a crush on the guy. Before they hooked up, he called his mom and said, Mom, I think I fucked up. And she's like, sometimes we fuck up, baby boy. Come home if you need me. And after he hooked up with Lom, that's what he did. He went home and he told his mom flat out. And she held him and let him be a mess about it. But when you're in the closet, your brain doesn't work right. You are under constant surveillance to maintain the heteronormative veneer over your life. The show does not make this hypothetical. Their friends and family are snapping pictures of them in public and questioning every relationship they have with someone other than Lom and Yiwa. And I'm going to say it really plainly. All of the really negative takes I saw about Lom that were really unsympathetic to what this man went through made me, as a 30-something-year-old gay man who survived being closeted, really extremely uncomfortable. And I really need you to reckon with whatever you were going through that made you turn on a closeted gay man and view him as the evil aggressor party.
He points out that how you respond to fictional people signals to queer people how you'll treat them. And this doesn't just go for the queer community, this goes for any marginalized community. It's the same principle as suddenly resorting to childhood bullying tactics the moment you hate somebody. You can mock them for being fat all you like because you don't care how they'll feel, but how about all the fat people in your life who you don't hate? How do you think they feel seeing you use that as an insult? How do you think the closeted people you know will react to seeing you treat a closeted man as a villain, constantly saying you want to punch him in the face just because he won't be open with his intentions, because he can't? Do you think they'll feel accepted by you after that? Lom also never asks Nur to go back into the closet for him. Nur has a support network who loves him and he's out and proud, and Lom never at any point tries to remove him from that or invalidate it. But he didn't tell Nur his engagement was fake, so he's the devil incarnate, apparently.
แต่ตอนนั้นผมก็สังเกตเห็นเลยว่าผมไม่ใช่คนเดียวที่รู้สึกแย่คืนนั้นเด็กผู้ชายอายุ15ก็เลยกอดกันร้องไห้กับเด็กหญิงอายุ13แล้วก็กอดความลับของกันและกันมาจนถึงทุกวันนี้เป็นส่วนหนึ่งของความลับของคุณด้วยได้ไหมครับรักคุณรักคุณ
We got the show we'd been asking MAME to make for years, and y'all found a way to shit all over it anyway. Not for any fault of the show's own, but because you were looking for reasons to hate it, because that's what you expected to find. And when you didn't find it, you made it up. And I can already hear you asking, how do we define bad representation then? Because if everything is up for interpretation, then nothing is ever actually allowed to be labelled as bad, right? Not quite, but kinda. My first year uni poetry module, yes, I am that kind of wanky artist, we had a lecture on bad poetry and how to define it, and we discovered, essentially, that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to defining what makes a bad poem. Because any rules that you come up with, you will inevitably find a poem that breaks them, and is still good. This is the main problem with any kind of art criticism. There are no hard and fast rules to define any of it, and there shouldn't be. Something that touches you at your very core, in the deepest and profoundest of ways, might be on somebody else's DNF list. Cormac McCarthy's The Road is held up as a bastion of literature, and I've never hated a reading experience more. I have to admit that some of my beloved mutuals do not like Bad Buddy. and yet I can still love them for who they are, and they're still my mutuals despite knowing how insane I am about that show. We all have different taste levels and life experiences we bring to the table, and that means that not everything is written with you specifically in mind, which means that sometimes things will just resonate at a different frequency to you, and you won't understand the hype that everyone else seems to feel.
You can make an argument that nothing is inherently bad. The problem with labeling anything as bad is that bad is a moving target. What is bad now was not bad 30 years ago, might not have even been that bad 5 years ago or a year ago. But then the other kinds of bad, the kinds that follow the inherent rules of writing or structure, or even just down to the base element of does this spark joy? The more intrinsically and pedantically you break down these labels, the harder it is to define any single thing as bad. It's frustrating because there are things that are just badly written, but people can like them. Some people liked the finale of The 100. All that means about them is that I question their taste level and we almost definitely would never be friends. That doesn't mean anything about them as a person except that they like something that is bad. And what does it mean that it's bad? And what makes it bad, other than the fact that it fundamentally betrays everything else the story had been leading up to up until that point? I've made a lot of jokes about Colleen Hoover on this channel and how she's a bad writer, because by every metric that I judge writing, it's bad. She's repetitive, her characters are very one-note, the relationships she writes are often toxic and frustrating, and to me, that's bad. To a lot of people, that's bad. But to a lot of other people, that doesn't matter. To a lot of other people, it's good. Colleen Hoover is an incredibly popular writer. She's probably made millions of dollars. If we're judging solely on the metric of popularity and money earned, she's a good writer. Right? And what makes her writing bad is in some ways what makes her writing popular, which is a confusing mess to try to break down to anybody. So it's much easier to just go, oh, well, Colleen Hoover's a bad writer. I don't like her work. And it's easier to do because she's so wealthy. It doesn't affect her that I don't like her work. It's much easier to take the piss out of her one-note writing and her insane characters and that one passage about the size of the child's balls than it is to spend 15 minutes boring the pants off somebody, trying to pass through the subjectivity and objectivity of good and bad, and popularity and the metrics by which we measure success. Bad is a moving target.
But none of that means that bad representation can't exist. As an ace person, I for one was deeply offended by the way O was written in the final season of Sex Education. She's one of the few canonically ace characters we have, and they made her an almost irredeemable bitch for no apparent reason. As an aside, if Yasmin Benmont wants to come on my channel and talk to me about the differences between what was done in the writer's room while she was there and the final product, I would absolutely love that. I follow you on Twitter, Queen. Please hit me up. But my disappointment in the fact that the character is actually bad representation does not outweigh my joy, or Yasmin's, that an ace character was put on screen in one of the biggest shows on Netflix, and with actual ace people's hands in creating her. That's bonkers! Do you have any idea how amazing that is? Do you think shows would have done this 10 years ago? God, no! So like, yeah, O is bad representation, but on the sliding scale of bad ace representation, she's not even close to the level House stooped to, which I've brought up before. That episode framed asexuality as either people with brain damage or people who are lying to appease others. Sex Education is at least humanizing O enough to say that her asexuality is valid while making her one of the most insufferable characters on the show, seemingly entirely by accident given what we know of the production. And you know what? Sometimes ace people are assholes, and that's feminism. As a community, we're so used to only being allowed to see ourselves represented on screen as villains or antagonists or as disposable side characters that we don't know how to respond properly when those kinds of characters are actually being written from queer perspectives or with the community in mind. We try to reject them anyway because we're too used to being burned. But this only ruins things that are going out of their ways to cater to us, rejecting them for a whole host of arbitrary reasons while we seek exactly the same representation in things that are clearly not for us. And this is where I need to grind this video to a halt to discuss Taylor Swift. I don't like talking about Taylor Swift because there are parts of her fandom that genuinely frighten me, and it's those parts of the fandom I want to talk about today, so please offer me thoughts and prayers in the comments. Before we get started, I should acknowledge that I like a lot of Taylor's music. I hated the Reputation era, and I'm not the biggest fan of her outside of her music, but that shouldn't matter because her music shouldn't be defined by her public persona. Overall, I'm fairly neutral on Taylor Swift. Please do not dox me for that. Thank you. What I am not neutral about is GAYLORS. In case you live under a rock and do not know what GAYLORS are, they are a faction of Swifties, usually queer themselves, who define themselves by a conspiracy theory that Taylor Swift is secretly a lesbian and is sending them secret signals about it. Think the Larry Stylinson crew. Bearing in mind that as one of the most influential celebrities on the planet, she does not need to hide her sexuality from the world, but also, even if she was, trying to out her is not the best way to deal with that. Please see my Kit Connor video for reference. Anyway, in the notes of her release of 1989, Taylor's version, she lamented the constant eyes on her and her relationships, and says, quote, "If I only hung out with my female friends, people couldn't sexualize that, right? I would learn later on that people could and people would." And GAYLORS lost their goddamn minds. Look, I have ADHD. I get the rejection sensitivity dysphoria of having somebody do something that you perceive as a slight and going into total meltdown. But Taylor Swift being heterosexual should not send you into that kind of a tailspin. One person said, "Honestly, it's kind of a homophobic statement. People couldn't possibly think I'm having sex with my female friends, right? Some people are gay, Tay." That's very clearly not what she meant by saying that. What she was saying was that she is straight, so she assumed people wouldn't jump to conclusions about her female friends, and that people like you were doing it anyway. We all have personal headcanons about celebrities. We don't always need to plaster those headcanons on our social media or make them our entire personality, and we definitely don't need to make them that celebrity's problem. There are certain members of K-pop groups that I think are possibly queer. Am I going to talk about it on this YouTube channel? Absolutely not a chance in hell. I'm not risking accidentally outing somebody or even just bothering a person who is simply trying to live their life with my speculation. But because they're celebrities, thousands upon thousands of people think that is okay to do and are somehow offended when Taylor Swift tells them she's straight and doesn't like her private life being intruded upon in the most softball way imaginable. As Susan points out, getting queerbaited by Taylor Swift is like losing at chess to a hamster. People screaming, shaking, crying, throwing up at the news that Taylor Swift is not only not gay but has also been made uncomfortable by the constant speculation around her friendships sit at the same table as fans of TV show ships that ruin the actors' ability to spend time together by only seeing them as a couple and not allowing the space for them to exist as co-workers or friends.
I would very much like to be excluded from this narrative.
See what I did there? This, again, is becoming an increasing issue. I've discussed it in numerous videos, most recently my Tom and Zendaya one, but it's come up even more since then, particularly in relation to OnlyFriends. In a similar way to how people need to find a moral reason to justify hatred for something, people can also fall into the bad habit of projecting their dislike of a character onto the actors, or vice versa. For example, I hate Top Mew. I think they're a terrible pairing that shouldn't be together, and I think Forcebook are doing a fantastic job. My dislike of Top Mew doesn't reflect on them. If anything, it reflects positively because their acting choices are making me feel things, whether those feelings are good or bad. But the backlash against them, and specifically on the actors, has been so severe that JoJo has cut scenes out because he was worried the fandom would react badly, and that worry isn't unfounded. I've spoken before about how Asian fandom is cultivated differently, but it is starting to get concerning how much worldwide we're willing to let slide when it comes to fandom behavior towards actors and writers and directors simply for making decisions we don't like. Or even decisions we do like. The amount of overstepping people do about Pedro Pascal is insane. I'm also not going to pretend that this backlash doesn't disproportionately affect women, people of color, queer folks, and not conventionally attractive people. Societally, we are just more likely to forgive the sins of attractive or palatable people. It's unfortunate, but it is true. But there are people who hate Forcebook and are using their portrayal of characters who are supposed to suck in the show as a way to justify their hatred of the actors. And it's like, guys, I think y'all need to find hobbies. Have you considered knitting? Rock climbing? Not bullying people for liking actors that you don't like until they feel so piled on that they want to delete their account? As an aside, MJ, please never delete your account. I love you. The OnlyFriends finale aired the day I'm writing this, and while I have mixed thoughts on it myself, people are, as they have been the entire run of the show, taking things in the worst possible faith interpretation and then using that interpretation to frame the show as wrong or bad, and to have a go at JoJo because... And the best part is that these people are all going to bat for different characters and are all angry for totally different reasons. Like, some of them are angry about Top Mew being together and claim that that makes the writing bad, and those same people would probably hate the people who liked Top Mew but are angry at the handling of Boston Nick, etc., until the heat death of the universe. As another Tumblr friend of mine, Archer, said, "The level of media illiteracy I have witnessed today could only be rivaled by incels that love and misinterpret American Psycho, Fight Club, and the 2019 Joker." Like, even if you cannot comprehend the fact that a narrative does not always provide some sort of overarching message that is meant to be taken seriously, seriously, do you understand that what you're trying to say does not line up with anything JoJo has done in the past? The warp effect alone, which was in fact trying to say something, should tell you that maybe you're not comprehending something properly. Truly cannot believe we are at the writers are always trying to pass on a moral message through everything that happens to their characters kindergartner stage. Boston not getting the same explicitly happy ending as the rest of the characters seem to does not mean the writers are trying to pass judgment on his promiscuity, nor does it mean they want us to. What it probably means is that oftentimes the promiscuous person does get blamed and ignored when they strive for their own agency, because that is straight up just a thing that happens all the time! And maybe this show really is passing judgment on Boston, or maybe they just didn't think about the implications of this ending, but really think about Jojo Tchigon, known lover of whorish behavior, and whether or not he is judging the sins of Boston as a character, and that's why he got the quote-unquote bad ending. It's not even a bad ending, by the way, it's bittersweet, for sure, but he's young and he's moving to New York, and through his relationship with Nick, he's figured something out about himself and how he views relationships, and now he's going to carry that forward into any future relationship he might have.
ขอให้มึงโชคดีกับชีวิตที่มึงเลือกที่นิวยอร์กแล้วกันนะ
I do agree that it felt icky coming right after everybody told Boston he was bad, but also that doesn't mean the show or the writers are framing that as true. We knew from the start that this group of friends was messy and hypocritical. That's the point of the show. These people are terrible friends to each other, and that doesn't end just because the credits are rolling. They're going to continue to be terrible, and maybe they'll stop talking to each other, or maybe they'll stay trapped in these toxic cycles forever. But either way, interpreting Boston's ending as a commentary on his character feels like a really weird take from the same fandom that hated this man for the first half of the show.
กูถ่ายรูปไว้อยู่เลยทำไมวะกูแค่อยากบันทึกช่วงเวลาอันโรแมนติกของเพื่อนสนิทไว้ผิดอะไรเก็บไว้ครับ
The fact that we can feel such powerful empathy for a man we despised a few episodes ago is actually a testament to the fact that the writers are probably trying to get us to think about this in a critical way, to sympathize with Boston over his shitty friends. Would I have preferred an extra 10 minutes where Boston isn't slut-shamed by the people he loves most? Yeah, sure. But that would be going against the thesis of this show, which is that you can empathize with characters who make bad decisions, who screw each other over, who are bad people. If they spent the last 10 minutes making every character do a 180 on their hypocrisy, it wouldn't have impacted audiences in the same way. Empathizing with him is the point.
So while I'm editing this video, I've been thinking about it, and while I do think that it is ridiculous how quickly people will turn on a showrunner the moment that he does something that you don't like, I do also think it is disappointing that a show that started as something that was supposed to be like breaking the mold of your typical BL structure and showing non-monogamy and showing more of that lifestyle of the queer community outside of the boundaries of like safe BL. It is disappointing that like it ended in a way that was quote unquote safe. However, I do think that expecting it not to do that, even if it is helmed by JoJo, you're sort of setting yourself up for failure a little bit there, because it's a GMMTV show. GMMTV is like the Disney of BL. Like, they're so straight and narrow. They are a like publicly funded channel in Thailand. It's very much like expecting Disney to co-sign non-monogamy. It might happen, but it's going to happen very subtly, and it's going to happen not because Disney wants it to happen, but because the writers are trying to sneak it in under the wire. Like, JoJo is doing an incredible job with the constraints that he has, but that doesn't mean the constraints aren't there. Do you know what I mean? Like, I do sympathize and empathize with people like Ben, who I love, Hi King, who like wanted Sand to be more aggressive, not roll over to Ray, who wanted Boston to not be treated the way he kind of was by the narrative, although, like I said before, I don't think that the narrative is endorsing the way he was treated. Like, I empathize with wanting more of the messiness, more of the bonkers behavior, more of the fun and insanity and bitterness, but I just don't think it was ever going to end in any other way, because it's GMMTV. Unfortunately, this is what they're like. Unfortunately, like, anything that's on a mainstream channel is going to end up being constrained by those things, which sucks, but the fact that we're getting this far in only a few short years compared to like a couple of years ago, the stuff that GMMTV was putting out, I think is like a pretty big deal, and I think it's pretty good. It's still a stepping stone. You know, we're not at the final boss yet, but like we're getting there, and JoJo is definitely like a forerunner for that, you know?
Or Maybe Jojo is secretly a prude who hates sluts. I don't know him personally. But I'm also not going to put words in his mouth. All I'm saying is to take a step back and think more critically before you take something you were offended by and decide it is unilaterally bad because of that. And also, you can't complain that the show is messy and frustrating and then complain again when they cut things out and sanitize the show to make it more palatable. You do not get to have your cake and eat it too. I know that most people aren't, but there's a reason why Jojo and the crew felt the need to cut certain scenes or change things around, and it's not because the fandom was being super normal and respectful about the show and its cast. I've linked some posts below by other less verbose people that go into more detail on my thoughts about the Only Friends finale, because otherwise this video is going to go on forever. But to wrap this up, reducing a show down to which diversity points it wins, or how much good representation it has, is never going to leave you with the best thing to watch. I can promise you that. Listing off a show's representation instead of its plot, or putting the tentpoles of diversity on a book's dust jacket, or selling a trailer based on whether or not the writer is a minority, is a frustrating and frankly exhausting way to consume any kind of media, but it's how everything is starting to be advertised now. Just win in diversity points left and right, in short, TikTokable phrases about whether or not it has insert minority here characters and is therefore worth watching. Or, as Tumblr user Dr. Von put it, "Hey Tumblr, you like non-stereotypical depictions of autism? What about neurodivergent protagonists? Yes? What about asexual neurodivergent protagonists that go on chapters-long rants about their special interests? You want gay characters that are important to the plot too? Then I've got the book for you. The author is gay." American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis is, do you see how insane that makes us look? Do not watch things just for the labels we ascribe to characters. Watch things because you like the sound of the plot, or you've heard positive reviews, or you've seen the actors and other stuff with different partners before and they were good and you want to see how they are with a new love interest. Also, read American Psycho. It fucks, but not for the reasons incels think it does. The problem with identity politics is that it is often tainted by the opinions of individuals, which can spread until there are whole groups of society who are claiming with an entirely straight face that Taylor Swift is homophobic for not being gay. Or Our Flag Means Death is perpetuating bury your gays for killing off one gay character amid a sea of other queer characters who were all given happy endings. You're allowed to be hurt by the decisions writers make. You're not allowed to be hurt by Taylor Swift's sexuality though, please get some help. And you're allowed to be affected by something enough to drop a show entirely if that's what's best for you, but that doesn't make the writers bad or incorrect. It just means it might not be for you anymore. But please, don't become what 2016 Clexas became, because there was a group of those people who dropped the show, called it homophobic, dragged it relentlessly through the mud, and then continued to speak on it until the show ended, despite supposedly no longer watching it anymore, to the point where in the finale, they decided to bring back the actress who played Lexa for a cameo, not even as the actual character herself, you know, because she was dead, but as an alien wearing her likeness, because the writers were so desperate to appease a faction of the fandom that weren't even watching the show anymore. For mistakes that were made 4 years earlier. We all say things like, I'm being so normal about this, and I would like to point out that outside of the fun, jokey context, framing any emotional response as normal or abnormal is going to lead to an unhealthy relationship with yourself, but sometimes we all need to take a step back and rather than ask ourselves if we're being normal about something, really evaluate whether our response is disproportional. That's the real crux of this issue. Is your response to a character death disproportional to the context that death occurs in? Have you taken that emotion to its logical conclusion, or are you seeking out reasons to rationalize away any irrationalities in your response? Are you going to drop the show because it's negatively affected your mental health, or are you going to start anonymously DMing everyone involved in the show as a spiteful hate campaign to seek revenge for those feelings? Are you actually advocating for better representation, or are you just looking for an easy target to vent those feelings of frustration upon? It's very easy to fall down the rabbit hole of overreaction. I've done it, and I'm sure you've done it too. But what we have to be mindful of is turning into reactionaries, because that approach to media criticism and to life doesn't serve anybody, least of all ourselves. Maybe Our Flag Means Death is bad because they killed off your favorite character. Maybe The Only Friends finale was judgmental to one of the characters for his lifestyle. Maybe The 100 was homophobic because the lesbian died. That's only on you to decide for yourself. But you don't get to decide that for anybody else, least of all the writers themselves. And putting words in anybody's mouth and then arguing with the straw man version of a show is only ever going to make you miserable. Now, does that mean that the next time something I personally dislike or am triggered by happens in a show, that I'm going to react in a completely level-headed way about it? Have you met me? But it does mean that I will take a step back for a few days to evaluate whether that reaction is justified or whether it's a me problem. I think that's all I have to say on this topic for now. I can't wait to get fucking lambasted in these comments. Feel free to like, share, comment telling me all the ways I'm wrong and have personally attacked you by disagreeing with your opinions about shows. And if you're interested in a 2-hour retrospective about 2000s crime procedural show Psych, feel free to subscribe because that'll be coming out soon-ish. I'm off to go and rewatch all my favourite gay little shows and pick them to pieces until I hate them. And young?